Hello, I'm Dr Jodie Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. I make the bed every morning. I straighten the sheets and I shake the doona so it's all level, and I place the pillows and then straighten everything so that it looks good. And the moment that the bed is made and the curtains are open, I just feel like an exhale, like my shoulders drop a little bit. I've done this for as long as I can remember. I don't ever remember getting up and not making my bed. And so it was no different that I made the bed on the morning that Pete and I were getting ready for work after our first night together in what was our new home back then, and we're still in the same home nearly 25 years later. So I've made the bed, I've straightened it all up, I'm like, yep, getting ready for work, that's done. And no sooner as I'd done that, Pete sits on the bed and he was probably putting his socks on or something. I honestly could not believe it. Like, I'd never seen that happen before in a home. And so I asked him if he could please hop up so I could fix it. Now, what's really important to know is that my mum had an anxiety disorder. She still does, like me. And like so many baby boomers, she had no idea. And what she did know, though, was when she was able to clean the benches, when the clutter was away, when the benches were wiped, when the toilet was clean and the carpet was vacuumed. We had shag pile carpet, wasn't allowed to walk on it once it had been vacuumed, and the beds were made. She knew she felt better. And once the beds were made, as you probably guessed, there was no sitting on them. That was not allowed. And then, we'd obviously just hop into our beds at night and then make them again the next day. So when I'd asked Peter to hop up that day, first thing he said was, why? And then he said he didn't think that was reasonable, and that if I felt the need that I could obviously straighten it, but he was going to sit there and put his socks on. And that's what still happens in our home. And I actually, when I think about Pete and me and our relationship, I know that he and I are such a good match because he helped me to start to sort of question some of the behaviours and some of the actions that I was taking that were really fueled by a lot of anxiety and the need for order and tidiness and cleanliness that I'd been, sort of brought up on. So until I was able to obviously get a handle on my mental health, and those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a long time will know that I ultimately ended up being diagnosed with major depressive disorder, which was what took me from kind of trying to manage through to getting some help, and has ultimately made all the difference for me. I was doing what I'd seen my mum do at home. I also know that as my mental health improved, I was better able to tolerate more mess. And in fact, I can tell now that I might be going a little bit downhill when the little things around the house that don't normally bother me start to really sort of grate on my nerves. But I am actually happiest still when our island bench is clean and clear, the bed is made, and our daughter's bedroom door is closed. Say no more. So for me, and I know for so many, a messy house can really equal a messy mind, but for others it can really be quite a trigger for stress and anxiety. And so when I was reading the conversation and I came across an article titled, "Why is a messy house such an anxiety trigger for me, and what can I do about it?" I immediately emailed the author, Dr Erika Penney, to invite her to join me on the podcast to talk about it, and she said yes. So she's been very patiently waiting for me to share a little bit about why I really want to do this episode. She is a lecturer in clinical psychology at the University of Technology in Sydney. She has a wealth of experience as a lecturer, a clinical psychologist in mental health, complex trauma, personality disorders, mental health stigma, and improving patient outcomes with trauma-informed care, and so much more. So, Erika, thank you for your patience, and thank you so much for joining me to talk about what I think is potentially something that a lot of listeners today will be able to relate to.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, so, I think it's important that we talk about these things that happen every day and not just wait for some really big event to occur in our life before we start talking about mental health or what keeps us well or what improves our mindset.
Yeah, I agree. And I know a lot of your work is in stigma as well. And so this is another, or reducing stigma, this is another opportunity for us to just normalise things. And I know no matter what is happening for me, and life throws lots of curveballs and it's challenging a lot of the time. But when we know we're not alone, but also get some ideas from someone like yourself about, well, what can we do to sort of make life a little bit easier day to day? That can have quite a ripple effect for our mental health, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. And just watching out for where are we on this spectrum? Does everyday things or clutter, have this small ongoing impact on me? Does it have no impact on me? Or do I feel significant struggle every single day? And this might be a symptom of something bigger. I mean, I think these are very nuanced, important conversations for us to have with the people closest around us and also to introspect and reflect on within ourselves.
Yeah, it totally. And, I'm going to ask you in a moment, sort of what led you to write this article, and I'm so thankful that you did. And I'd love to direct people to have a read of it when we're finished. But I remember being a brand new mum, and goodness, does the house ever end up cluttered and messy? I remember with Mother's Group, we'd taken in turns to go to each other's houses. Although there was one mum in our group who I've never been to her home, and I'm not quite sure why she never felt comfortable having us around. We totally respected that. But one of my Mother's Group friends, she always had a spray bottle of like a spray and wipe or a kitchen spray or something, and a cloth sort of visible. So every time we went around there, I thought, I wonder if she's literally just been cleaning. But there was also a little part of me that sort of thought, that's actually a good idea just to put it on the bench because it shows an intention. So if people come to my house and I haven't been able to get on top of things, if I just literally put it on the bench, it'll show that that's coming. It's going to happen soon. I don't know. But maybe I overthink it because of my own history. But yeah, what led you to write this article? Because it's when I talk about your expertise, your expertise is obviously in mental health, and no doubt you've come across people where this has been an issue in your time, but such an interesting topic to write about and so relatable. So yeah, what prompted you to write that conversation article?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in the everydayness of our lives and the spectrum of that from straightforward to complexity. So, a lot of the clinical work that I do and some of the teaching I do is with quite complex presentations, clients with quite complex trauma or developmental trauma histories. And so even more so, there can be this separation of I'm so different from the everyday. And yet I think that there is this spectrum where actually the everyday can impact all of us from in quite straightforward ways to quite complex, activating ways, depending on someone's history. And I think sometimes, particularly in the healthcare system, in Australia, but in other countries as well, there can be such a focus once you get to the complex end that there's this loss of reflecting in everyday life and this nuance of, well, how am I traveling now? And is this something that's impacting me? How will I make my life improved or more fulfilled? And so I think that spectrum really interests me. And so I'm often very interested in everyday experiences that can be quite common to people of all different experiences, backgrounds, levels of complexity.
One of the things that I really am going to grab onto from what you've just said is this idea that the everyday experiences that we have are really worth us spending time thinking about how are we travelling so that we might be in a better position, won't we, to be able to do something to kind of, if we think about a spectrum with an arrow at each end, one to the right of complexity and one to the left of more everyday kind of challenges, that we might be in a better position to be able to go, right, well, how am I feeling? And I think about my own home and Erika, when I was diagnosed with depression, because I'd had undiagnosed anxiety for a long, long time, and I was in my mid-20s when I got diagnosed, I'll never forget all I would do was clean because that's what I saw my mum do, and it was a
Yeah.
distraction. And since having treatment, going through years and years and years of therapy and learning more about myself and finding really healthy ways to cope and express how I felt and to really look after myself, I have cleaned a lot less than I ever did. And I still have a relatively sort of clean-ish lived-in home, and I'm very, very lucky and very privileged in that once a month I have somebody come for 2.5 hours to help me with the wash of the floors and a few things. But when I notice that it's really grating on me, then I start to get annoyed, frustrated, anxious, stressed about some of the little things that normally I could walk past, then I'm like, oh, that's a sign for me. So I know that now. And then I'm like, oh, what's really going on? It's not about the bowl that's been left on the floor in the lounge room for the 50th time. Maybe it is, but mostly not.
Yeah, it's interesting. This almost like U-shaped curve, of sometimes when there's so much clutter around, it can cause us to feel agitated, and yet at the same time, being overly preoccupied by it, going too far on the other side, feeling like I have to make it perfect, I have to make sure everything's okay. I feel, more comfortable or safer or like a better person when I'm cleaning more, can also then sort of create these other challenges. So there's this interesting kind of dynamic of how we find that balance in terms of what's the right amount for each of us.
It is, isn't it? And when we are spending an inordinate amount of time and disproportionate amount of time kind of trying to keep on top of everything, it really does take time away from other things that might be really fulfilling or really good for our mental health or for our connections or our relationships. So balance, I think, is, and like you said, it's going to be different for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah. Because, I think some of us have got so focused on, oh, it's another chore I have to do, that we can feel a lot of guilt as well. Oh my gosh, I shouldn't be doing this other thing. I should be, tidying this up. I should be fixing this thing. I should be modeling some good behaviors for my children or whatnot. And where is it? Yeah, let's come together and maybe actually shift our mindset about it and say maybe there's actually a level of mindfulness we could have about just simplifying life and doing simple, house tasks, but together as a family or very mindfully, and thinking about what the real ultimate purpose of that is versus the times where we think, you know what? We do have something better to do. Let's just try and be flexible and let that go today.
Yeah.
So, and I think your experiences are very, relatable. I certainly have found different periods of time in my life where I'm overly focused on, I've got to make sure this looks okay every time someone comes around. I'd almost have like a obsessive kind of list before anyone could come round to visit the house. And yet, at what point does that continue to bring me value and meaning, and at what point is it actually just starting to contribute more to stress or anxiety?
I relate to that so much, and Mum and I were having a conversation the other day actually with her sisters. We were out for my mum's birthday lunch, and Mum was kind of thinking back to when, if she'd have guests, she would wash all the windows of the house, and the house would have a full clean from head to toe before anyone even arrived. And she said she couldn't enjoy the visitors. She was exhausted, and then pretty much when everyone left, it would all happen again because, of course, the toilet needed cleaning again and the floors needed vacuuming. And when Peter and I, first started, when you start living with someone else and trying to sort of organise life around two different people coming together in a home, I remember Peter would say, let's have our friends around. And I would think of all the things I needed to do to prepare the house for guests. And he would be like, but they don't care about that. And he had a very different, perhaps in some ways, maybe a bit too relaxed. But he had this really, I think, this healthy perspective on people are coming to see us. And he said, I want to have my friends around. And I'm like, but I don't feel I can get everything done. And he said, well, that's okay. And I'm like, but I feel too anxious. He said, that's okay. You don't even actually have to be here if you don't want to. But he didn't want me and my need for cleanliness to stand in the way of us actually inviting people over. And yeah, it was just a product of the way I was raised. Do you see that a lot in the sort of the work that you do, that these influences from our upbringings?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the work I do is in a frame called schema therapy, which really is looking at these different parts of ourselves. And sometimes we inherit these parts of ourselves from our families or our caregivers, our upbringing. Sometimes we develop them almost in compensation to what we saw, growing up. And so I think often, if you've been part of a family where it was almost the message is, well, unless you have a clean home when people come around, there might be something almost not moral about, you might not be a good enough person, or there's something not worthy, if based on this particular trait. Or I see a lot of people, get hung up on maybe things like, parents who say, well, you haven't been a good enough child because you haven't made your bed today, or you haven't cleaned your room. And of course, trying to instill certain structure and routines around that can be useful. But if we start overly interpreting it about whether you're a good or not person, I think it can become so defining about, well, how could I possibly sit with this then? There's this part of me that is trying to protect the other parts by going around, cleaning, making sure everything's okay, so that I don't have to, so that I can protect the more vulnerable parts of me, feeling not good enough or not worthy or not okay, or whatever that messaging might be. But I think your story is interesting in terms of, that difference between yourself and your partner, because there has been some research as well to say that in some of the studies, there was one where women of dual income homes were more likely to have higher cortisol, which is that hormone associated with stress, when they were in more disordered and cluttered homes than the men in the study. And this is true even when they controlled for other sorts of factors like, how satisfied the person was in their marriage and how happy they were, and personality factors. And so there have been some studies that might suggest there is this potential gender difference. I wonder, the last one I remember is maybe from about 2019. So I do wonder about how this might change, over the decades, and as our society does become more progressive and gender roles change a bit. But there has been some of this research to suggest there can be this difference too in women being more likely to hold on to messaging that who I am might be attached to how things around me look, more so than on average men might notice or feel that. Of course, that's not a black and white rule, and we know that there's nuance and variance in every group, but that there could be historically some of these differences amongst genders as well.
It does make sense, although, I feel as though that generational trend is being broken in my family, because my son and my daughter are the exact. My son takes more after me than my daughter, and,
Yes.
and hence the closing the bedroom door, so I just don't have to look at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think you're right. I think that as time goes by, where originally women were homemakers. That was sort of the role. And I was recently interviewing someone who said women couldn't even own their own home until kind of like the mid to late 70s, let alone, having to have a husband to own a home with. So much has changed in the best way. And I think this idea of what does it say about me? If someone were to come and there was a bit of fluff in the corner, or the benches weren't wiped, or there was papers to put away, what does that say about me? And I think without really ever kind of consciously thinking about that was very much at the heart of where I was coming from. And I know how much healthier I am now, because I think going through a really significant stage of my life where my mental health was really poor, extremely poor, that I came out of the other side of that with a very new lens as to what actually is important, and probably a better, it's so much healthier in terms of my nervous system and my thinking and things like that. But I guess like a fundamental question is why does it make us feel overwhelmed when there's clutter and messiness around us?
Yeah. Well, and first, to also say to people out there, it's this for some people it does affect them almost not at all. But on average, what can sometimes happen is that the brain has been hardwired to single task. We all like to think in our modern society that we can multitask, that we can have lots of distractions, and we can still, be productive and get things done. But our brains are really designed to focus on one thing at a time. And so what some of the neuroscience literature says is that, when there's a lot in our visual field, there's a lot going on, it's taxing parts of our brain, it's taxing our working memory, and it's leaving less attentional resources for the other things that we really want to pursue or what we would prefer to be doing in that moment. So it becomes our body starts to feel this overwhelmed. There's too much going on. I can't focus. I'm starting to feel stressed, and that the clutter or disorder or so many distractions. Really, it's really like all these distractions by having these things in our visual field can make it our whole system just start to go into more of that sympathetic nervous system or that fight or flight mode. But having said that, there are certain factors that reduce the likelihood of it being as bothersome to someone. But I think that's why, particularly in the modern world where we so prize multitasking and we so prize being able to do 1,000 things at once, without really recognizing that's not actually the way that our brain works best.
Erika, is multitasking a myth? Because from what I've read in the past, it's almost task switching that we do when we think we're multitasking. Can you tell us more about that? Am I wrong in my interpretation of the information that I've been reading about this?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, is I think the idea of it depends what we define multitasking as, but I think true multitasking, the way that people intuitively think of it as if I'm going to do 2 or 3 things at the same time. I'm sort of cooking, but I'm also dictating an email on my phone, or is largely a myth. What we are doing is we're switching very quickly between different tasks. So I stir the food and then my brain leaves that for a moment to start dictating, and then I have this thought, I better check on the food, so I stop dictating. I quickly try and stir again, and I'm switching. And so people who are more effective at it have a faster processing speed to switch between those tasks. Yeah. But even if you are more skilled at it, it still is a more stressful state for the body. You've got to use a lot more cognitive capacity and resources to do that. And a lot of the research would suggest that if you really tally up all that time, it actually would have been quicker to do most tasks as a single task, one by one after each other, than it was to try and do them all together simultaneously.
Oh, okay. That is interesting. And it's something that I've noticed as I've become older, is that maybe the processing speed is slowing, but I'm much less able to go between tasks and switch tasks than I once was, and it used to be something that I would pride myself on. I'd have 5 balls in the air at once, but one of the things that I would find about the clutter in the house, and I know I've read from women, and particularly women who write about the mental load, because it is particularly Leah Ruppiner. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. She's written some articles for The Conversation as well. But just this idea that you'll go to, so for example, I'll be picking up a few things off the floor because I'm setting my vacuum off to clear the house, and then I end up picking up some socks that have just been taken off, teenage feet and chucked. Then I'll take them to the basket, and then I'm like, I should put on a load of washing. And then I'm like, well, I should probably fold the washing, because once this washing has finished in the washing machine, it's going to need to go, And then once you fold the washing, and then you're like, oh, it's just like one thing leads to the next. And that is probably a different conversation, but that can be a very, very overwhelming thing about attempting to kind of get some control around us. That it can feel like this domino, and this becomes this insurmountable kind of 10-task challenge where you literally just wanted to get a few things off the floor to begin with. How can we, I don't know, help, please help.
It's such a common experience. I mean, similarly, I think to myself, I only really have time to do this. So I just start to do that, and then I think, I'm really not going to feel okay until I do 10 more things. So I try quickly do each bit in the... And I guess, it's bringing that level of mindfulness or reflection or awareness in the moment if we can. And if we can't catch ourselves in the moment, then noticing in hindsight that this is a pattern for us and reflecting on it, thinking, what will I do next time I'm in a situation like this? Because what I think people will find is that for some people, that chaining effect might actually be very useful. So someone who might struggle to think through 5 different steps in advance actually might get going better by saying, well, I'll just do this part. Okay, now I'm here, I will do the next step. Oh, now I'm here, I will just finish it off. So, reflecting on, is that sort of chaining process actually quite useful for me? And so just doing a tiny step actually helps me. Or am I feeling like once I start, I can't stop till I get through all of these things, which actually causes me a lot of stress and anxiety, is interfering with, I really did actually need to get back to work at that time, or I really didn't would have preferred to go outside and spend the rest of that afternoon with my family. And so if you're noticing those patterns, I think it's about saying, well, how will I disrupt that, pattern? What is it that is really keeping me in it? Is it one of these beliefs like, well, if I don't get it just right, I won't feel like a successful person, or I won't feel like a good person, or I'll have let the family down, or is it something even just more non-verbal than that? I just won't feel settled until it's all done. And then really asking ourselves, well, is that how I want my life to look? Is what is truly valuable and giving me meaning? Or is it getting in the way? And if it's getting in the way, what is an alternative belief that I could try to have that would help me redirect my focus at those times to say, okay, I've noticed I've done the first 2 tasks. That was useful. I now have this urge to do the third. What do I really want my life to be about? Shall I follow that urge, or shall I sit with the discomfort because how much my family or downtime or work means to me is so important? I'm willing to sit with the discomfort of pausing here in order to have those life goals. But I think we all have to sort of reflect on that because, as I said, there will be some people who actually that chaining of activities is the better way for them to eventually get to bigger tasks. So it's so important, I think, that we pause and we reflect on what is our habitual habits in everyday life, and are they leading us where we want to go, or are they preventing us from going where we want to go?
So with clutter and mess around us, what's kind of going to feel okay for us is going to be very individual, very different. But beyond reducing cortisol and hopefully reducing mental load and stress and the other distractions in our visual field that can sort of compound and add to our overwhelm, what are some of the other benefits that we might expect if we can get a reasonable handle on keeping things clutter-free to a certain extent without going overboard? Are there other benefits to getting things a little bit more aligned in our homes?
Yeah, there's some really fascinating research, and look, some of them have been with relatively small sample sizes, and yet there does seem to be some impact that we can show that clutter or disorder can impact our behavioural choices as well and how we interact with others. And there's been some research to suggest that people who, there was one study where they asked people to sit in either disordered and cluttered rooms or quite orderly rooms and just laid out snacks and saw what happened. And people who were in the more disordered or cluttered room were more likely to choose less healthy snack options. And what I thought was very interesting about that is there was another study that was published a few years after that first one that I think tried to look at some nuance around that. And although they replicated the findings, they also found that if people were reminded of times that they felt in control or an agency over their life, they actually were less likely again to snack on unhealthy options, even if they were in the more cluttered room. And so there was this impact of, whilst clutter can impact our behavioural choices, our mindset can also buffer that if we're more aware, if we feel we have more agency, if we're not feeling powerless, if we're not feeling like I don't have agency in my life. But even beyond that, those sorts of studies, there's, been studies that show that the more there was one study that called clutter more like home chaos, and the more home chaos there was, actually the less effective someone's parenting style became. There was more likely to be less attention, direct positive attention with their children. There was less ability to respond to emotional cues. There was less effectiveness when they were asked to participate in a child-parent interaction task. And so I think there's even been one study where people were less likely to donate money when they were put in really cluttered environments and then asked, about different choices they would next make. So we can see how our environment can impact our behavior, and a lot of it's just happening in these unthinking ways. We're distracted by other things. Potentially our visual field is so distracted and cluttered, it's harder for us to shift that meaningful focus to, a particular person in our household or choices that are valuable to us. And yet we also see that can be buffered by our mindset, our sense of agency and empowerment in our life, the way we look at ourselves and the environment around us.
Erika, that research is so interesting. And so there are so many benefits that we might experience as a result of having some sense of order in our homes. And I'm going to ask you in a moment to share maybe a place for us to start, but I can't overlook this idea that sometimes settling down the clutter or creating a more orderly environment for ourselves can sometimes mean parting with things. And if we do share a space with other people, sometimes parting with things can be really tough. And just on the weekend, my mum and I spent a couple of hours going through their shed. Mum and Dad have moved a few times, which means they've kind of whittled down the belongings that occupy a shed space to a certain extent. But there are so many things that my dad won't let go of. And it's been incredibly frustrating for Mum because we both know that he's not really going to use most of what is in there, but still found it very hard. And in fact, he watched us like a foreman as we went through the shed on Sunday afternoon. And I said to Mum, I don't think it's so much about the stuff, it's about what it represents. And for him, they're his tools and his fishing rods, and he's not in a state of well-being to be able to sort of get out and fish. He's not even able to drive at the moment. He had a stroke a few months ago. And I said, I think this is about parting with these, is parting with the hope for the usefulness of these things in the future. It's more than just stuff. So that was my best estimation as to kind of why he was struggling so much. But it's very complex, isn't it, when people can't let go of things?
Absolutely. And when that process, and I think we can all relate to that in some way. There's probably been items in our house that someone else cannot understand why we keep, and we feel so attached to it. We sometimes aren't even able to put words as to why it is really important. And I think trying to reflect on that why is really useful. Is it because this has some sort of sacredness to me, some sort of link maybe to someone in my family or someone that I've lost, or a really important, you know, uh, value, that it has about who I am or what I'm about. And at what point is that, one or two really important items? And at what point is that I actually am struggling to let go of almost anything? And we know that
Mm.
to the more extreme end of that spectrum may be, people struggling with things like hoarding disorder, where it does just feel almost impossible to let anything go, that everything starts to become imbued with some sort of meaning, or some sort of discomfort in letting it go. And so I think reflecting, on that importance is important. And if I wonder for people who've had similar experiences to you, if there is that capacity to have that conversation to say, I wonder if this is really meaningful because of this factor, because it has meant this about your life, because there might be some grief attached to what it means that you can't use this anymore, or that you can't use it the same way that you used to. I mean, I know that you had I think Marie Vakakis on recently was talking about couples therapy, and I'm sure she would have a lot more to say about these sort of interactional dialogues. But I think the more that we can be open with the people we live with, or are around, to say, look, you've got this whole room of stuff, and it's really starting to stress me. I feel quite stressed about it. I feel that we could be using this space more valuably for our relationship, or our family, or to be able to do something, but I can see that it's really difficult for you to let it go. So, can you help me understand what it means to you? I think if we can get these things out in the open without a sense of blame, without a sense of, oh, you still haven't done this and you still haven't clean that up, or I've asked you 100 times to do this. If we can have these deeper conversations about, I wonder if maybe there's something about it that's very difficult for you, that I wonder if we could talk about that, allows, these conversations, I think, to say, well, where's the middle ground between us? That you're allowed to have certain values. I'm allowed to have slightly different values. But how do we find something that's going to be in the middle enough for both of us?
Such good advice, and I think when we can just be, like you say, have these open communications and just be curious about, well, help me understand a little bit more about where you're coming from. And yeah, I can see that under a lot of circumstances would make a really powerful difference. Certainly not with my gorgeous dad. He's not open to discussion. And so we agreed, Mum and I agreed to, we wished we'd hidden a few things before he checked the pile for the tip, because he brought a few things back. But I get it. And, and it's not so overwhelming, the shed, it's not a big deal. But for some people it is a big deal. And so sometimes extra help is needed. At what point would, oh gosh, I suppose sometimes it's the person who's living with the one who won't, who can't let go of things, that wants them to get help. They might not be really ready and willing to change. So that can probably be a little bit tricky, can't it? If a person is pretty happy with the way they're operating, even though others around them aren't.
Yeah, and I think that's where it is possible to have that conversation of, this is how it's impacting me. You
Mm.
know, what are your thoughts about that? Can you help me understand more? Can I help you to understand some of the impact it's having on me? And I think, we do all need to normalize that and I think you do a fantastic job of this actually in your podcast and in the work that you do, but we do need to normalize that it's normal. It's normal to feel stress. It is normal to be imperfect. It is normal to have some disagreements. It is normal to feel, anxious, about certain things, and to decide, at what point is it feeling like I no longer have the tools or agency, or I don't feel empowered to make change about it in my life. So if someone has, feels that they look around their home and it causes them such distress that they're not sure how to function or what to do next, or they look around their house and then they spend 2 full days doing a huge clean, and yet at the end of it, it doesn't feel like that's solved any problems. There's something more
Mm.
going on. To not feel that, there's anything, we will, some of the statistics in Australia is that at least half of Australians will meet criteria for a mental health diagnosis at some point in their lives.
Mm.
So, we're not different from other people if you're experiencing something that feels too difficult for you to manage on your own. I think it's important for everyone to feel like, okay, maybe now is the time to ask a professional how I might manage this differently. Just like if you had a cough that, lasted for a week or two, well, of course, everyone has coughs, we should normalize that. But if it gets to week 6 and week 8, and you might think, oh, this isn't going away, it's really starting to impact my life now, of course you would see a professional and say, what are my choices here to try and manage this and get a bit more functioning back in my life? And I think we need to think about mental health and our well-being in the same way.
Mm. Erika, thank you for sharing those stats. I think anyone listening who is struggling, I hope, will be listening and realising that, yes, it's very normal to have ups and downs and challenges, and that if you are struggling and feel like you could do with some extra support, please take this as an opportunity to kind of like remind you to reach out and make that connection with your GP or with your mental health professional, and start that conversation so that you can get on the road to feeling and functioning a whole lot better. Erika, just before we finish, what would be, for somebody listening who's thinking, oh, gosh, I need some advice as to where to start because I feel overwhelmed with the clutter and it's quite overwhelming, so I'm putting it off, I'm procrastinating around it. And yet I know that if I can just make a start and start to get a little bit more order around me, I'll feel a lot better. What would be a good first step? I know there's a lot of steps to this process, but where would be a good place for people to start?
Yeah, I think the very first thing I would do is try and challenge this idea in anyone's mind that there is a perfect way to do this. And I think once we let go of, I've just got to come up with the best way to tackle it, and instead I just need to come up with a way to tackle it, can already shift our mindset a little bit into that good enough instead of perfect mindset. And I would think about, is it about just breaking it down? Is it about saying, I can't do the house, I can't do my whole office, but what I could do is I could just start by clearing off my office desk, or I could just start by clearing off the kitchen bench, nothing else. And we literally just choose one very small element of the task and say to ourselves, and then when I get to the end of it, I'm going to say, good, I made a start. I feel better about it now. It's easier for me now to do my, particularly if you start in a really high usage area that often catches your eye. I'm just going to do that one bit in the hallway that catches my eye, and it's what makes me think of it every single time. But I'm then going to give myself permission to just pause there. For others, if even that feels difficult, it's okay to ask for help. Now, if you're in a very lucky position that you could ask a professional cleaner to come in even just once to help you get started. But even if that's inaccessible, even asking a friend or a family member, I really struggle sometimes to get started with difficult
Yes.
tasks. If you could come over for an hour, we just start with this one bit together, and I'd be happy to reciprocate. And if there's something that, you need help with, I could come over next week and help. And I just try and break it down into something a bit more manageable and So, or even, is there any way, and this won't be true for everyone, to make it a bit more enjoyable too? Like, what if I knew a family that had an hour of power every Saturday, they called it, and everyone in the family had 1 hour to do as much as they could, but when they got to the end of that hour, they would call it a day. And because they all did it together, there was this sort of fun competition. They put on music, you got to choose, they took turns who would take, choose the music. So, or if you live alone, do you like particular podcasts? Do you like particular music? Can you have that on while you do that one element of the task? And I think then if for someone they feel like I'm trying all this, it's too difficult, it's so overwhelming, that's where, as you said, I would reach out to your local GP and say, what are the options to talk about this with someone? And if you're unsure, maybe then still talk about it and have someone say whether, help you determine if it's a problem or not. And there are, of course, wonderful psychologists you can see in the community. And if cost is a really big challenge, there are also digital mental health anxiety programs that people can have a look at first to see if that would be useful, like through MindSpot or This Way Up. And This Way Up has translations into many different languages, which is very helpful as well. And just kind of seeing whether there's a small place to start and going down that path to see where it leads.
Oh, thank you so much. You have such compassion and such kindness in the way that you talk about how people can get going, and that it's finding a way and reaching out, which is what Mum did. Mum was like so overwhelmed by the shed, and in 2 hours we had powered through. We had a great time doing it. We reminisced about a lot of stuff. She found her engagement ring that had been packed away, and the relief she had, the messages of thanks I've had in the last couple of days have been just so heartwarming. She just feels like the most enormous weight is lifted. And so I think that, your suggestion to reach out and ask for help is really, there's so many great ideas. Erika, you've shared so generously with us today. And I wonder if people wanted to connect with you, can you tell us please about the other article that you've got 2 articles on the conversation, and how people can link with you on LinkedIn to stay in touch if they'd like to?
Yeah, so I've written another article for the conversation about how to clean up mum and dad's house when they may have passed away or moving to aged care or assisted facilities, and the stress that can take on you when you have to go into someone else's home and suddenly it's your responsibility for packing it all up, putting things together, moving through the grief process sometimes too with these belongings that have meaning. Can I let go of them? Should I not? So people are also very welcome to look up that article if that may be something they resonate with as well. And people are more than welcome to look me up on LinkedIn. I'm just under Dr Erika Penney. As you said, I'm a education focused senior lecturer at UTS, so that's how they'll know if it's me on LinkedIn. And I often talk about some of these issues, but also I do a lot of work with digital technologies in healthcare as well. So if that's something of interest to people, they can certainly reach out.
Oh, thank you. And it's Erika with a K as well. So that'll certainly help you to nail that profile on LinkedIn straight up. So Erika, thank you again. Thank you not only for the generous way that you're sharing your knowledge through your writing, but also through your time here with me, but for the work that you're doing as well. It's really important, and I know your time's valuable. So thank you for sharing some of it with us. Thank you so much for listening. And if you know someone that you think might really benefit from this episode, please share it. It's so appreciated too. If you enjoyed it or you learned something, if you could write a review, it'd be really appreciated. And I read everyone. They're very uplifting for me, but also it helps other people who are looking for a podcast they can trust that might actually be helpful for them to know where to land in a sea of so many podcasts online. So thanks again for your time, and I will be back again next week with another wonderful, wise guest. So I'll see you then. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. you'll find me at Dr. Jodie Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.